This week we're going to be building this fully modular set of Hedge Maze dungeon tiles.
All of these being made with super cheap materials, but making them look awesome.
If you're anything like me, you love to build out a beautiful, detailed, immersive environment to bring your players into the game that you're throwing for them. And for me, there is no better way than with over-the-top, detailed, engaging terrain. So today I'll be showing you how I built this fully modular set of Hedge Maze garden tiles to try my best to really bring the players into that world and give them as much immersion as possible. The idea being to follow along similar to dungeon tiles, where we can have them all merged together as one big piece, or our DM can put them out one at a time, taking them away and putting new ones down as our players reach different sections of the maze, keeping it more mysterious and not allowing us to metagame and see what's outside of where we currently are in the maze. I got the inspiration from this build from a post on the Tabletop Crafters Guild by Nate Harris. I absolutely loved what he had done, so I reached out and asked his permission to essentially copy his build, as I didn't want to do that without asking him first. He graciously said yes, and I couldn't be happier because I think this could inspire a whole lot of you into building something beautiful for your table. This will actually be a two-part series, as I'm going to be focusing on the maze today, and then in next week's video we're going to be building out some scatter and those topiaries that really do add a next level to this build. These are all made from super cheap materials and is a very easy build, but as I get further and further into my process, I do start adding in a lot more flocks and 3D printed little bits and pieces and extra details that maybe everyone doesn't have access to. So as we go, keep that in mind and just build it up to a point that you think is good enough for your table. First things first, we're going to need a whole heap of MDF tiles as our bases. So I'm going to jump up into the garage and start cutting these down to size.
I'm using quite thin MDF. You could cut this up with a Stanley knife. That just takes a lot more time. So pulling out the drop saw really helped me cut out a little bit of extra effort. But my measurements weren't quite right.
It's so hot out there, but we now have some 3x3, 3x6, and 6x6 squares to build from. I might let myself cool down and then come back to this later on. Okay, so these guys came out pretty nice in a 6x6, but after remeasuring, these weren't quite right. No idea how I managed to do that, and I'm not gonna bother to recut all of these, but if you were to spend a bit more time, you could get a much cleaner finish. But I didn't, and we are just going to work with what we have. So the main element for this build is really going to be these scouring pads. Most of them come in a base green, which is perfect. I bought this first batch off Amazon for way too much money. After doing this, I did notice that at my local Coles, which is a supermarket here in Australia, I could get a pack of 5 of these for 60 cents. So I recommend checking out some cheap shops and supermarkets. But if you don't have any other option, you can always jump on and get these ones from Amazon. These are in fact a perfect 6 inches, which really did make it a little bit easier for my build, but for the cost, probably not worth it. We are going to have to trim them down for some of these other ones that I didn't get the measurements quite right on, but for now, I'm going to cut these right down the middle. These don't have to be perfect every time. We just want them to be a decent height so that our minis are kind of hidden behind them, but we also don't want them to come up too tall because that would kind of just block line of sight for anyone trying to look down on the table. I'm going to do a whole heap of different ones, some thinner, some wider, some with stopping points and doorways and some corner pieces. I'm making this up as I go along, so it's definitely not going to be perfect. I'm sure we could work out a much cleaner and better system for this, and it would be even nicer again if I actually made all these match up properly, but for now, we're just going to work with what we've got. Alright, so I've just spent a little bit of time in the aircon cooling off and drawing up a rough plan. By having a little bit of a plan, I am hopefully going to come up with the best way that I can make these and get the most reusability and most range out of this build. So for now, I'm going to start sticking these down and seeing what I can manage.
So I grab out the hot glue and the hot glue gun and just start sticking all of these cut up scourers in place, building out our basic walls before coming in and measuring out where I want all of our openings to be. I've decided I want a 2-inch opening on the center point of all of our major builds. So we trim these down to size and fill in the gaps leading up to these openings, giving us a nice large square piece. And that's our first piece done. Time to move on to the rest of my plan. I spent a good while going through gluing down all of these scourers and trying to make as much variation as I could. On these longer pieces, I kept those 2-inch openings by gluing in these little pieces on the edges. This also helped to hold all of our longer flat pieces upright as a little bit of extra stability. And as you can see here, they mashed together nicely. So I just kept on going, building out a huge amount of variation, trying to do as many different types as I could, working with my initial plan, but also just making up a few extras as I went along. Ultimately leaving me with a huge variety of awesome base pieces for our maze. Then we take them outside and coat them with a green spray paint, making sure to cover up all of the ground as well as hitting some of those hedges, and then leaving it in the sun to dry.
Okay, now we are done with the basic spray paint. I probably should have done this before I glued everything down, but So the next stage is putting in some pathways. This step is probably not 100% necessary, but I really like the way that it came out on the builds that Nate put up, so I'm gonna copy that too. And what we're gonna need for this is some thin pieces of cardboard. And I just so happen to have gotten a whole heap of them with our scouring pads. So I'm gonna cut this up, glue it down into some random brick patterns, and go from there.
For this you could use just about any scrap cardboard. This stuff was a good thickness for me, but I also ended up using some extra bits and pieces from other scraps as I wanted to fill in more and more pieces. I just cut them all into random rectangle and square shapes, then stuck down a heap of cheap PVA glue along the pathways that I wanted to follow, spread the glue out, and just started puzzling all of our bricks in place. I decided to point them upwards as the basic brown cardboard colour would be a good base colour for our bricks. Then when I was happy with this, I just repeated the process over all of our other builds, going around and sticking down brick after brick after brick.
Okay, I am back after a week in bed with the sickness that shall not be named here on YouTube. But I'm finally feeling back up to it and I'm gonna get to crafting. So I'm gonna grab my first few of these and start painting our stone walkways before coming in with a few more details. If I'm honest, at this stage, these are already playable. If you just want something basic to represent your hedge maze on the table, this is enough, which is a super quick and easy build. But I think it's a little bit boring. I like my tables to look as real and immersive as possible, so we're going to paint in our stone pathways, bring in some flocking and some extra wildlife. So let's do it. So my workspace is a bit of a mess, but that's sort of just how I roll. I'm not going to be super clean and black backgrounds and perfect bases like you see a lot of other channels, because that's not the way I work, and I'm pretty sure that's not how most of you at home have your craft spaces set up. So it's time to paint our walkways. These have their basic brown already there. As I mentioned, you could just leave them as is and you'd have a perfectly playable maze piece, but I want to take this to the next level.
So I pulled out a ushabity bone from Citadel and started to dry brush quite heavily over all of our pathways. Not worrying too much if I got it a bit messy around the edges or in between, as this will all be covered up with flocking later on. I was happy with the colour, it gave me that sandstone texture that I wanted for these base tiles, but I wasn't always happy with how the dry brushing came out, so I did end up coming through and kind of stippling it onto a lot of different areas, rather than just the heavy dry brush, because I felt like this gave me a nicer stone looking texture. And then repeating this on all of our tiles.
Okay, and now that we have a wall of hedges ready to go, we're going to need to start sticking on some flocking to add a little bit of extra something to those hedges. For this, I'm going to be using Quick Grip Spray Adhesive. This stuff is a lot easier to work with when sticking things like flocking to a lot of builds, as it doesn't take as long to dry as PVA glue, Mod Podge, or super glue. So we're going to be hitting every single one of these with a heavy dose of this stuff right here, and then covering it in flocking. Now before we get going on our spray glue, we're going to need to mix up a whole heap of different flockings. By mixing these up first, we're going to hopefully have enough to cover the entire board and keep it nice and consistent. So I've got a box to mix it into, something to keep anything extra from falling off when we add it onto our boards, and a whole heap of flocks to mix up. So let's start pouring those together.
The more variety that I can get in this mix, the better, as it'll give me a nice natural variation to our hedges. And as we all know, nature tends to have a lot of variety, not just one clean colour. And now that we have a nice random mix of flocking, it's time to take all of our hedges outside and give them a coat with the spray adhesive.
So that's been sprayed. We give it a minute to go a little bit sticky. At the moment it's still wet. And then once that has gone tacky, we just start coating it in our flocking.
I'm just pouring this on and allowing it to stick, then kind of pressing it against all of the excess that's fallen down and filling in any of the gaps by hand. Anywhere that you've missed with glue is fine. You can come back in with another spritz of the glue to fill in any gaps later on, but honestly, even where there are random bits missed is fine, because not all plants grow perfectly, and we've got that nice green base underneath anyway. Ultimately, I did come back in over a lot of these with a little bit extra glue, just to make sure that we covered in all of our batches. And look at how much difference it makes once we've covered all of these hedges with flocking. They're really coming to life. So I went around and kept on covering up the rest of my hedge pieces. Obviously you don't need to make as many as I did, and there's probably quicker ways to go about this, but I did what I did, and I took a whole lot of time adding in all of our flocking. And now this is why I did everything in this Tupperware container, so I can collect up the rest of this flocking mix. That'll come in handy in next week's build when I make a heap of scatter terrain for this maze. So our basic maze is starting to look pretty good, but we need to fill in that base. So I'm going to come back in and spread out a heap of cheap PVA glue around the edges and in between all of our bricks. Once we have this whole base coated, I'm going to grab out a static grass applicator and start covering them with a combination of flocks and grasses. Then coming in with a darker, smaller flocking that'll be used to help tie everything together. I was pretty happy with this, so I just started to repeat the process over the rest of my maze. As I did the rest of them, I did the bulk areas around the sides first, and then decided to come in later on and fill in all of the bricks, as this was just a easier way to approach the overall size and scale of the build that I was attempting. So once all the sides were done, I came in and painted in a heap of glue in all of the cracks between our tiles, and then coated them with that same smaller flocking, as I didn't really want bigger pieces of grass sticking out between our walkways. This worked perfectly, so I spent the next hour or so painting in all of the gaps between every single tile on all of the maze pieces that I had built. I kind of wish that I had made the gaps between all of these bricks a little bit bigger, because this process would have been a lot quicker. But I didn't, and ultimately it really did lead to a beautiful end result. Once that had a night to dry, I came in with a cheap makeup brush and wiped away all of the excess flocking, cleaning up our bricks and giving us a beautifully clean end result.
At this point, it is more than acceptable as a playable piece of terrain for your table, but I want to add in just a few little extras.
So I went to my bits box and pulled out a whole heap of little 3D printed scatter terrain that I often use. I painted up a heap of mushrooms, little critters, and extra bits and pieces that I could place down around our models to give them a little bit of something extra. Most of these are free on Thingiverse, and if you have a resin 3D printer, they are an awesome addition to any build. Now we have a pile of these tiny little bits painted up, it's time to start sticking them down to our maze to add a little bit of visual interest. So I start adding in mushrooms and of course my tiny little frogs, and then some skulls and bones to give the impression that some people have never escaped the maze. Now while I'm doing this, I also grabbed out a heap of static grass tufts and flowers and started adding these in just randomly around the place to add a little bit more variation before going around and repeating this process over every single one of our maze tiles. I love having a few extra details for my players to notice as they're exploring different environments, and it's also just a lot more fun to build. I then came in with these pink flowers and added them onto every single one of our maze tiles as just a way to tie everything together and give a little bit more of a magical garden feel. And they're a great place to hide a few more creepy crawlies. I then added a whole heap of different bits and pieces to the front entrance of our maze, just so it really did show what the players should be expecting when they are to enter, and with that, I called it done.
While building out this terrain, I've come up with a heap of really cool and creepy encounters that I really want to run. So I'm going to be probably throwing together a one-shot that I'll be playing over at Tomes and Towers RPG. So jump over and follow us over there and keep an eye out for that if you want to see these played out in game.
So you could stop at any stage of this build, from the basic materials to the flocking, or go all out with the details like I do.
As for now, we'll add in a few bits of scatter that I've built particularly for this maze and show you guys the hero shots.
I love how modular these have come out, giving us the ability to really lay out a huge maze and change it up as we please, giving us an entirely new way to approach a dungeon crawl. I can't wait to throw my players into this mystery maze and see how they deal with the ever-changing environment. The addition of the topiaries, garden beds and scatter terrain really does make the difference for this maze, and I'll be showing you how I built most of these in the next episode. I hope you guys have found some inspiration in this build, and a big thanks again to Nate Harris for the inspiration for this entire project. I absolutely love having a fully modular maze system to mess with my players. Until next time, never stop making stuff.